Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, and tonight we have a very special show about someone who definitely changed our history, our society, and our culture. It's Nelson Mandela, who died recently at the age of 95, and he'll be the subject of the entire show tonight. Nelson Mandela, as you well know, was imprisoned for 27 years during his struggle to end apartheid in South Africa, and his successful efforts in that respect have become a worldwide model for the struggle for justice and freedom for all people. Through a combination of Mandela's own words and some documentary, I hope to give you a better idea of what he was about. One of the interesting things that people don't mention is he was basically a country boy, and here he tells about the initial inspiration for his fight for justice in society.
My father was a polygamist. He had 4 wives, and I regarded all of them as my mothers and their children as my own siblings. They told me about the old stories of bravery amongst our people. You know, this opened my eyes to something totally different.
But what he noticed that was totally different was politics. He moved to Johannesburg and he became a politician, freedom fighter, terrorist, depending on your point of view. I'll let you decide for yourselves based on his first television interview with ITN British Television in 1961.
This is Mandela's first television interview. I asked him what it was that the African really wanted.
The Africans want the franchise on the basis of one man, one vote. They want political independence.
Do you see Africans being able to develop in this country without the European being pushed out?
We have made it very clear in our policy that South Africa is a country of many races. There is room for all the various races in this country.
Are there many educated Africans in South Africa?
Yes. We have a large number of Africans who are educated and who are taking part in the political struggles of the African people. The question of education has nothing to do with the question of the vote. On numerous occasions, it has been proved in history that people can enjoy the vote even if they have no education. Of course, we desire education, and we think it's a good thing. But you don't have to have education in order to know that you want certain fundamental rights, you have got aspirations, you have got claims. It has nothing to do with education whatsoever.
Well, that led to the famous story of his trial, his imprisonment, and his release. And here it's told in a New York Times video, with most of the details being filled in by New York Times editor Bill Keller, who for 4 years was a South African correspondent for the paper.
Nelson Mandela, who led the emancipation of South Africa from white minority rule and served as his country's first black president, became an international symbol of dignity and forbearance. Mr. Mandela's quest for freedom led from the court of tribal royalty to the Liberation Underground, to a prison rock quarry, and finally to the presidential suite of Africa's wealthiest country.
The central goal was that South Africa would be ruled by South Africans. It was the cause of his life, and he achieved it.
Mandela first came to the world's attention while serving a life prison sentence for sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the state. He would become the personification of opposition to South Africa's brutal apartheid regime.
Apartheid was a system that was set up by the National Party government, an extremely formal race-based division of the country. Apartheid literally in the Afrikaans language means apartness. It means that the races were not meant to live together.
In the early 1960s, Mandela led the ANC, the African National Congress, on a road of armed insurrection against the apartheid regime. It would lead to his eventual arrest on charges of conspiracy to overthrow the state. Mandela's legend grew when he arrived at his trial wearing traditional Xhosa leopard skin garb to underscore that he was an African entering a white man's jurisdiction. The South African government of Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd was under pressure from liberals at home and abroad to spare the defendants. Nevertheless, the judge sentenced them to life in prison.
The sentence in the case of all the accused will be one of life imprisonment. As you thought. Very well, the court will adjourn.
Nelson Mandela was 44 when he was sentenced to hard labor at South Africa's notorious Robben Island prison.
They were placed in small cells. They did manual labor. They walked off every day to these limestone quarries where they smashed up limestone that would be used to build highways, roads.
Under the National Party's rule, ethnic clashes and violence were rampant. In Mandela's view, By the mid-80s, the enemy was already morally and politically defeated. His strategy, he said, was to give the white rulers every chance to retreat in an orderly way. Mr. Mandela's decision to begin direct and secret negotiations with the white government was one of the most momentous of his life. He made it without consulting his comrades in the African National Congress, knowing full well they would resist. He was released from prison in 1990, at the age of 71.
It was clearly an electrifying moment. Again, it was a symbolic moment because a lot of the important stuff had already happened before then. He'd been negotiating literally for years the terms of a deal that would legalize the opposition parties and begin the process of democratizing South Africa. But that was the moment when I think, it was just in everybody's minds, they just said, oh my God, it's real.
I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant.
The South Africa that he walked out into was kind of a mess. I mean, it was the campaign against apartheid had set itself a goal of making the country ungovernable, and to some extent they succeeded. The townships were erupting in violence, and everybody sort of knew that the established order was beginning to crumble, but nobody knew quite what was going to succeed it. So people were very, very anxious.
2 years after Mandela's release from prison, black and white leaders began negotiations that would lead to the end of white rule. All the while, extremists, black and white, continued to use violence to tilt the outcome their way, as Mr. Mandela and the white president F.W. de Klerk argued and maneuvered towards a peaceful transfer of power.
The key to the deal was the decision on the part of the ANC that they would share power for the initial stages of a new democracy, and that the president would have 2 deputy presidents from other parties who would participate in the governance of the country. Having established this constitution, they then had to prepare for something that South Africa had never seen, which was an honest-to-God election campaign in which most Africans got to participate. It was an amazing spectacle. He campaigned in white neighborhoods, too, and went to white events, but the unforgettable thing was to be in one of these small soccer stadiums in an African township. People sitting up on the tin roof, and then you sort of see this sort of dusty trail of cars approaching, and they'd arrive in the middle of the soccer field, and Mandela would get out, and the place would just erupt. And it was, profoundly moving, I have to say. Elections are just the starting point of democracy, but there is something about watching people get this privilege who've been denied it for a long time that you can't help but be moved.
The African National Congress won 62% of the vote, earning 252 of the 400 seats in Parliament, and ensuring that Mr. Mandela, as party leader, would be named president when the Parliament convened.
He had a cabinet that consisted of some of the people who had been his arch enemies. He didn't much like either of his deputy presidents. Thabo Mbeki, who succeeded him, was not Mandela's choice to be his successor. And F.W. de Klerk, who shared a Nobel Prize with Mandela, the two of them had a relationship that kind of seemed to veer between tolerance and loathing.
While Mandela disliked and blamed de Klerk for much of the trouble in South Africa, he did praise him for having the foresight to see the reality of the situation, and for having the courage to face it.
Mandela realized that in order to govern this country, he had to win over some significant percentage of the whites. He had to at least reassure them that there was a place for them. That was their government too. His presidency was about inventing South Africa. Post-presidency, he kept a very low profile, especially domestically. His successor was resentful whenever Mandela would speak out on anything political, and so out of respect for Thabo Mbeki and for the party, he only spoke out on things that he really cared about, like the AIDS issue.
As a former president, Mr. Mandela lent his charisma to a variety of African causes, joining peace talks to end several conflicts, and helping his third wife Grasu raise money for children's aid organizations.
I think Nelson Mandela will be remembered first and foremost for his courage and dignity and persistence. I think he deserves to be remembered as a man who made a free South Africa possible, and who did it by behaving not like a revolutionary, but like a politician, by sheer patient, disciplined compromise and negotiations.
People say Nelson Mandela's great problem is that he's too willing to see the good in other people. How do you respond to that?
I don't know. I think there may be an element of truth in that. But when you are a public figure, you have to accept the integrity of other people until there's evidence to the contrary. What reason have you got to suspect them? Your duty is to work with human beings as human beings, not because you think they're angels. Once you know that this man has got this virtue and he has got this weakness, you work with him and you accommodate that weakness and you try and help him to overcome that weakness. I can't allow myself to be influenced by that.
I think the best editorial on the death of Nelson Mandela was done by the Chicago Tribune, and I'm going to read that for you. It's called Mandela, Conscience of the World, and opens with the words he spoke at the Ravonia trial in 1964. During my lifetime, I have dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. In 1964, Nelson Mandela spoke those words in a South African courtroom while on trial for plotting to overthrow the country's all-white apartheid government. Mandela received a life sentence, and while imprisoned for the better part of the next 3 decades, he became a worldwide symbol in the fight to end the apartheid subjugating South Africa's black majority. But Mandela, who died Thursday, was more than just a symbol. His name was a clarion call for people across the globe in their struggles against oppression. He personified the triumph of nearly unimaginable perseverance over nearly unimaginable tribulation. After 27 years in prison, Mandela was released in 1990. Immediately at the age of 71, he began negotiating a peaceful transition to a multiracial democracy in South Africa, where racial policies had provoked generations of violence and hate. For the rest of his life, the world's most famous prisoner refused to show bitterness to his enemies, preferring instead to seek reconciliation. His actions were, and continue to be, a model for peaceful conflict resolution worldwide. When he shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 with his former jailer, South African President F.W. de Klerk, Mandela discreetly declined comment, realizing the wrong words might unravel the fragile negotiations to dismantle apartheid. Fittingly, he was elected the first black president of South Africa in 1994 in the country's first multiracial election. His top priority was to oversee the creation of a new constitution guaranteeing equality for all. He also brought together disparate elements of the country, black and white, to address the grinding poverty and homelessness that afflicted his country. Despite his enormous impact, Mandela was a self-deprecating man who would have rejected attempts to portray him as a martyr or saint. Modest to a fault, he often disarmed opponents and amused friends with his puckish sense of humor. While in prison, he played soccer with the other inmates, and his entire life he remained a proud and passionate soccer fan. He helped South Africa obtain the 2010 World Cup and was photographed beaming at the Cup finale. He knew personal tragedy beyond, but during imprisonment, his mother and eldest son both died while he was in prison, and he was not permitted to attend their funerals. His well-known second wife, married to him during his imprisonment, was involved in a sordid public scandal after their divorce. In 2005, his only surviving son died of AIDS, a disease that ravaged South Africa and one that Mandela assumed a public role in fighting. If one person could be called the conscience of the world, it would be Nelson Mandela. Nadine Gordimer, the South African writer and Nobel laureate for literature, once said of her fellow countryman, "He is at the epicenter of our time, ours in South Africa, and yours wherever you are." The best way for us to truly honor his life, his suffering, and his memory is to uphold the values he embodied and fight the injustices he forced the world to confront. His inspiration is universal, his legacy timeless. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps, and in closing, a final few thoughts from Nelson Mandela.
Think to the brain, not the blood. We pass through this world but once, and opportunities you miss will never be available to you again. The purpose of freedom is to create it for others. When a man has done what he conceives to be his duty to his people and his country, he can rest in peace. I believe I've made that effort, and that is therefore why I will sleep for the eternity